Good evening, all. Sorry to interrupt your conversations. So I'm going to be introducing both the topic and the speaker. But before I do, some of you may be aware, excuse me, that there was a study done not long ago on what happens during moments like this when the person is about to introduce the speaker. And they did a study on that, and they found that at any given moment, 10% of people were listening, 20% were thinking of something else, 20% were asleep, and the other 50% were actively engaged in sexual fantasy. So I hope you have a pleasant time. Albert Einstein once wrote on a blackboard, "Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted." 50 years ago, I attended a seminar by a Stanford University economist called Professor Moses Abramovitz. He was talking about wealth and happiness. In particular, he asked, as people get richer, do they get happier? Some of my esteemed and more mathematically minded colleagues pooh-poohed this question. You can't measure happiness, they said dismissively. But to me, the question seemed crucial. If you don't get happier when you get richer, why bother with economics at all? A parallel question these days relates to government budgets. The typical budget takes into account only things that can be measured in dollars and cents, things like deficits and surpluses, or the likely effect of the budget on the GDP, the total value of goods and services produced in a year. But what about the effect of the budget on the overall well-being of citizens? A well-being budget is one that uses not only financial indicators, such as GDP, to measure the performance of a country, but also indicators of the well-being and the quality of life of the population. Fortunately, a few countries are actually beginning to produce well-being budgets. They include, of course, New Zealand, Sweden, Iceland, and Scotland. Furthermore, right here in Canberra, the ACT has produced Australia's first wellbeing framework. This includes indicators on environment and climate, health, education, lifelong learning, and social connection. This wellbeing framework will inform ACT government policies, priorities, and investment decisions. How wonderful is that? Great work, ACT. And by the way, the next cab off the rank with a wellbeing budget framework will be Victoria in the coming year. Makes me proud to be a Victorian. Jacinda Ardern's New Zealand produced what may have been the world's first wellbeing budget. I'm not sure about that, but maybe Katherine will talk about that. Just 2 years ago, in May 2019. It was based on the idea that complex problems such as child poverty, mental health, excessive inequality of incomes, and climate change can only be solved if one looks beyond growth in GDP and takes into account also the social, environmental, and distributional effects of economic activities. Just because a country is doing well on average, that doesn't mean that all of its people are doing well. So in assessing a budget, you need to look not only at the influence of the budget on GDP, you need to look at its influence on national well-being. Let me give you just one simple example of how a well-being budget differs from a standard budget. In Australia at present, 1 child in 6 lives below the poverty line. How disgraceful is that in one of the richest countries on the planet? Now, imagine that we have 2 alternate budgets. The first budget gives tax cuts to the rich. Some of you may be aware that there is a budget coming up very soon, which will do that. The second budget, instead of that, ensures that no child will live in poverty. Now, let's assume that the deficit, the aggregate deficit, is the same for those 2 budgets. Does that mean that the 2 budgets are of equal value to the nation? Of course not. The first budget increases the welfare of the rich, but $10 extra to a billionaire increases well-being by such an infinitesimally small amount that you couldn't even measure it. Whereas $10 extra to a single mum may help her to put food on the table for a hungry child. A well-being budget says unequivocally that even though the deficits in those 2 budgets are the same, the second budget is better because it increases the well-being of the country more. Governments fund what they value. If we want them to value the well-being of the nation, we need to put that front and centre in the budget process. When considering new programs to fund in the budget, the government would then need to examine how these programs contribute to achieving its national well-being goals rather than just its financial goals. All right, so enough from me. We're privileged tonight to have as our dinner speaker a world expert on well-being budgets, Dr. Katherine Trebeck. Katherine studied economics and politics at the University of Melbourne and did her PhD in political science right here at the ANU. She is a writer, a researcher, and an advocate for economic system change. Katherine instigated a global collaboration of well-being economy governments, so she's not just an academic, she's actually working in the field, getting governments to do stuff about this, in 2018, and she's the Senior Strategic Advisor for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. Her co-authored book, which I'll hold up now, The Economics of Arrival, I love the subtitle, Ideas for a Grown-Up Economy. It's a beautiful subtitle. Was published in 2019. Katherine also developed Oxfam's Humankind Index. Perhaps unsurprisingly for an Australian living in Scotland, Katherine loves the rain and the Scottish mountains. When life allows, she is invariably cooking for friends in her beloved adopted home of Glasgow, ideally accompanied by a glass or 2 of Australian wine. Katherine, here you are, yes. I have to say to you, you have here in the room a lot of friends, including 2 people who've known you since before you were born. So you're in good company. So I'd like to introduce you, it's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce you Dr. Katherine Trebeck, live on Zoom from Glasgow, speaking on global developments in wellbeing budgets. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, and it's really a delight to be with you, and though really quite sad not to be there in person, but I'm really delighted, and such a wonderful introduction to the ideas that I'm going to be talking about. I want to take, though, just a moment, because while I'm not literally standing on the country, I was born and bred in Ngunnawal country, and I want to take a moment to pay my respects to elders past, present and future. And thank you very much for inviting me. It makes me quite homesick to be amongst a Canberran audience. What a delight. I will confess to you, though, a little anxious about doing the after dinner speech. regardless of the idea, what now half of you are now thinking about going to sleep, let alone even worse than that. But not least because I'm not a great Olympian with stories to tell of sporting feats, though my mother does remind me that when I was 5 years old, there was a photo of me on the front page of the Canberra Times for the egg and spoon race at Chapman Primary. So you have that in terms of my sporting achievements. And I also have to confess, just to get in the mood, because I've been watching you drinking your wine and having your dinner, I have put my morning peppermint tea in a wine glass just to get in the mood. So cheers to you, and I hope you've been enjoying your meal. I want to share with you 3 stories, really. One is the story of the Wellbeing Economy agenda and the dimensions and some of the ideas around that. Then I'm going to tell you the story of some Wellbeing Economy budgets and what's really happening, what's the state of play. And then I want to tell you the story of WEAll, the Wellbeing Economy Government's Partnership. And I'm going to finish because Peter and Lynn asked me to reflect on a couple of policy solutions. So I'll share with you a few ideas there. But let's take a moment to think about what it is when we talk about well-being and talk about a well-being economy. I mean, I don't know about in Canberra, but here in Glasgow, there are plenty of beauticians who advertise their services to well-being. And apparently it's just as easy as getting a good pedicure or a spray tan. I have media alerts for well-being economy. And so often what I get popping into my inbox is alerts of the Hyatt's latest new spa retreat for the wellness economy. And just down the road from me in Glasgow, in my local magazine, local newspaper store, I was waiting in the queue there, and I noticed there's a plethora of magazine titles, dedicated series of magazines to happiness and well-being. And I picked up one of these and I looked at the table of contents, and there was an article about 5 ways to better well-being. So I flipped the pages and thought, what are they going to offer here? And it's things like going on nature walks, going to a yoga retreat in India, and having your friends round for dinner, which of course is really, really fantastic. But what I found frustrating is that not everyone is able to do that. Not everyone has good, clean, safe local space nearby them. Not everyone can afford to go to a yoga retreat in India, let alone the carbon footprint of that. And some people have to work multiple jobs just to keep their food on the table, and so don't have capacity to have friends around for dinner or drinks as much as they would like. And it felt a very narrow, individualized interpretation of well-being. And I think that speaks to this duality of well-being understandings. There's very much the individual, subjective, self-reported well-being, which of course is absolutely vital and important. But what I want to talk about is really from a perspective of much wider, collective, societal, multidimensional understanding of well-being. And if you look at, for example, the OECD's framework for well-being, they include there, yes, subjective self-reported well-being, but things like health, civic engagement, work-life balance, social capital, and so on. And all the OECD countries that have a well-being framework very much see it as multidimensional. So I think that's really important to contextualize that we're really looking at various aspects of society, not just tallying up individuals and how happy they are. And when I talk about the wellbeing economy, the idea is that the economy matters fundamentally for that multidimensional well-being because it affects so many aspects of our quality of life, our sense of control, the quality of the air we breathe, dignity at work, and whether we have enough income to afford to go on a retreat to India. And so the wellbeing economy agenda is very much about thinking about how the economy can be in service of higher order goals. It's essentially about delivering social justice on a healthy planet. And we certainly can't measure that through GDP alone. One of the other aspects of the wellbeing economy agenda is that it is explicitly trying to do better than expecting government to just do all the patching and repairing and cleaning up after damage has been done. So much inequality, poverty, lack of lifting people up above the breadline, as you've just heard, relates to the economy. And then what happens is government has to step in. In Scotland here, people in social policy talk about this idea of failure demand. So much of what government spending is driven by is because of a failure of the economy to create lives where people can flourish and live with dignity. And then government has to step in after the fact. Ecological economists would talk about defensive expenditure, the amount of money that we have to spend cleaning up and repairing and rebuilding after the impact of the pressure we've put on Mother Nature. And in Australia, the various levels of Australian government through spending and tax reduces the levels of inequality by 40%. And that's incredible because it shows that the economy left to its own devices hasn't delivered good enough outcomes. And then that demands that the government steps in. And people are really starting to ask these questions. They're starting to pay attention to these issues of how much what the economy is doing is aligned with what really matters to them. And recent evidence from the Australian Edelman Trust Barometer says that almost 80% of Australians think that the gap between richest and poorest is unacceptable. Our friends Andy, the Australia's National Development Index, has said that people don't think the economy works for them and that they have different priorities other than GDP. And those sorts of figures are emulated by your colleagues and cousins around the world in survey after survey. And so the story of the Wellbeing Economy Agenda is really thinking about how can we design the economy in a way that it serves those higher order goals of social justice on a healthy planet. And in places the tide is really turning, businesses, government, citizens are asking harder questions of the economy, and they're experimenting and building the evidence base to show that change is possible, whether it's through theory, whether it's through economic modelling, and perhaps most importantly, just rolling up their sleeves and practicing the different changes that we need to design an economy that speaks to the needs of people and planet. But just as the momentum feels like it's perhaps growing, this agenda also has very, very long roots. You can trace it back perhaps even beforehand, but one of the key milestones is 1968, when Robert Kennedy, in his ill-fated presidential campaign, took a moment to really speak about the inadequacies of GDP. And if you haven't listened to that speech, it's worth putting in YouTube and turning the volume up when you play it, because it's one of the most poetic tirades against the flaws and in I guess what GDP doesn't capture. And we can come back to that in the Q&A after, but this has really got long roots. But just a few years after Kennedy's speech, Dr. Seuss wrote the book, The Lorax, which I suspect some of you will have on your bookshelves or have read to your grandkids or your children. And again, it's a children's book, but really putting front and center the damage that's done with an excessive focus on continuous growth. Just a year after that, the King of Bhutan announced that gross national happiness was more important than GDP. And since then, they've been working to figure out how to put that agenda into policy making. And then race forward a couple of decades. And in 2009, just after the global financial crisis hit, you had Professor Joseph Stiglitz with Amartya Sen and Jean-Paul Fitoussi commissioned by President Sarkozy of France. And they wrote what has, in retrospect, become a very landmark report, the Commission on Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress. And that was a real shot in the arm for the Beyond GDP movement. It encouraged a lot of initiatives and roundtables and citizens' conversation and gave governments some boldness in really starting to look beyond GDP. And then in the decade since then, the most recent decade, we've of course had agreement from all countries around the Sustainable Development Goals. We've had the burgeoning ESG, environment, social governance agenda in the investment community. And just down the road from me here in Edinburgh, in the other big Scottish town, there's a massive flourishing of ESG investment in the investment community there. And I hear there's a lot of that really welling up in Australia, also in Europe, less so in the US, but they're getting there. And then in 2018, my organisation, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, was founded. WEAll, which I'll talk about in a minute, was founded. And also, of course, young people started coming out of their classrooms on Fridays, inspired by Greta Thunberg, and striking over their fear for their future in the face of environmental breakdown. The year after that, in 2019, when Finland held the rotating presidency of the European Union, their big topic, their big theme for their presidency was the economy of well-being. So the momentum was building. And then, of course, COVID hit. And in fact, instead of slipping during the last 18 months or so, while the world has been dealing with this extraordinary pandemic, the agenda of thinking about how we can create a wellbeing economy has actually been gaining momentum and starting to reach into some mainstream conversations. So, for example, Joe Biden, under his presidential campaign, it had the tagline of "Let's build back better," a term that he stole from humanitarian colleagues. It came from the 2004 Asian tsunami. Boris Johnson also here in the UK talks a lot about the need to build back better out of recognition that the economy we had going into COVID wasn't doing enough to meet the needs of people and planet. Now, of course, with Boris, that might be one of his famous or infamous rhetorical flourishes, but his own treasury was commissioned the Cambridge economist, Professor Dasgupta, to chair a global review on the economics of biodiversity. And Dasgupta concluded that a focus on GDP leads to a focus on consumption and immediate investment with no attention to the impacts of the biosphere. This is a major UK Treasury Commission report warning of the danger of an excessive focus on GDP on the planet. And if we're looking at some of those same dynamics of how they impact people around the world, in last year's UN Human Development Report, the UNDP chief, Akam Steiner, wrote, "Humans have achieved incredible things, but they have taken the earth to the brink. Climate change, rupturing inequalities, record numbers of people forced from their homes by crisis. These are the results of societies that value what they measure instead of measuring what they value." Now, far be it from me to disagree with Akam Steiner, but the reality is that many countries actually do measure what they value. Statistics offices such as the ABS or the Office of National Statistics here in the UK do work to tally up various aspects of people's quality of life. Over half of the OECD countries have well-being frameworks like the one just brought in the ACT that encompass key aspects of collective well-being. The task now is to do something with these measures and put these frameworks into action, realign policies and budgets accordingly so that we transform the economy so that it does more of the heavy lifting in delivering what people and planet most need. So that brings me to the story of wellbeing budgets and government budgets specifically. Why should we care about them? I think it was reported that Martin Luther King was the one who said that government budgets are moral documents with numbers attached. They give us the potential to harness government spending for the outcomes that we want, rather than just being content to spend on patching and repairing and cleaning up after the fact. And so what are countries around the world doing on the wellbeing and budget front? I want to just quickly give you one wee tip. If you're looking for the best policies in terms of wellbeing economy outcomes, don't just look for those that have got wellbeing in the title. Look for those that look upstream and deal in the space of economic transformation and address the root causes of the challenges society is facing. And so many governments are taking this, they're taking wellbeing information and they're using it to inform and shape government budgets, whether it's France using its new wealth indicators and its environmental reporting in its budget process, whether it's Canada, it's Sweden with its 15 wellbeing indicators in its budget annex, Or it's New Zealand, as you've heard already, who's really putting its shoulder into this agenda, using the living standards framework that the Treasury has developed over many years to report on wellbeing status of various groups and then realign the budget accordingly to deal with some of the inadequacies of wellbeing outcomes. One of the things I really like about what New Zealand's doing is that they've got a cost-benefit assessment that has a 50-year horizon. And they also expect all the wellbeing bids that they put into, so this is on top of their recurrent spending, so there's a pool of money on top of that. They expect those bids to speak to 5 goals, things like supporting mental health, reducing child poverty and increasing child wellbeing, increasing the incomes of Maori and Pacifica communities, improving skills and opportunities, and moving to a low carbon economy. In Ireland, they've been using an equality budget group to look at the gendered nature of budget performance and budget supported policies. And what that revealed is a need to invest in parental care, to invest in more women in sport, to increase women's apprenticeships and the access that women have to research grants. This is the sort of changes that you can make when you take seriously that wellbeing information on how different groups in society are performing. In addition, governments are starting to use wellbeing to set their national development plans and their performance targets. And Scotland's one of the ones that's probably furthest along the line on this. It's got something called the National Performance Framework. And at its centre, it has well-being and kindness as some of the utmost goals of government and for the country. It talks about the goal of well-being of children growing up loved and cared for, of diverse cultures being embraced and expressed, of tackling poverty through sharing of opportunity, sharing wealth and sharing power. This is really, really important objectives of government. And other governments are starting to put in place the institutional structures to really give some muscle to some of these conversations. And Wales is my favourite example of this. What Wales did is have a major public consultation. And that yielded 7 wellbeing goals across some of the themes of multidimensional wellbeing. All Welsh public bodies have to put those goals at the centre of their decision making. And perhaps even better, they have this fantastic office called the Office of the Future Generations Commissioner. And her goal is to scrutinise draft budgets in terms of how they align to the goals. And she can look at the activity of all those public bodies and call out publicly if they're not sufficiently aligned with those wellbeing goals. And finally, there's also work around the world to help public servants, I should say. I've got trained into saying the UK way of civil servants, but to help public servants make the most of this wellbeing data. And here in the UK, the Green Book, which is essentially the Treasury's Bible for decision making, it puts wellbeing into appraisal and evaluation and requires cost-benefit analysis to take a very long-term perspective. Since 2018, it has shown colleagues in the Treasury and other departments how to make the case for wellbeing and how to go beyond monetary values if necessary. New Zealand's doing some really great work here too in terms of cross-departmental collaboration and working together beyond the silos that we so often see governments settle into. And it has even changed the State Sector Act to enable civil servants to collaborate more. I had a look at across these various countries of what they're doing for a report that I wrote on what children's wellbeing budgets would look like for Scotland and distilled some of the lessons. And I'm sure Australian states and territories and various aspects of the federal government are doing some of these areas. No country around the world is doing all of them. And so there's space really for governments to really lean into this conversation and stride out and really put wellbeing at the heart of policy making. And so some of the lessons looking around the world for what a wellbeing budget really needs to entail are things like that vision and bringing together the metrics so we know the state of play. It has to be about sustainable wellbeing, so track the health of the ecosystem as well over time. The OECD and New Zealand particularly are very explicit about this. Public involvement is really important. Whereas some other areas of policy making are often open for consultation and hearings and so on, so often the budget is a bit of a black box where people feel they have no idea how priorities are formulated. responsibility and accountability is absolutely key. And whether that's through a key nominated minister or a dedicated office or a commissioner like they have in Wales, it's really vital to have someone who's paying attention to rolling out these questions across government, and utilising government audit functions is really important as well. It also seems to be vital to put these sorts of ideas into legislation so that they are hardwired into government processes and so that the various roles are understood. And finally, government officials need help to do this. They need new tools, new guidance and training, new ways of working, and also incentives to put these sorts of goals at the heart of their decision making, their policy making, and to collaborate in different ways that they perhaps haven't been incentivized to collaborate before. Things like pooled budgets or cross-agency working groups that we've seen many more of during the COVID crisis. But I want to step back for a moment and just note that the budget is only as good as the basket of policies that it is funding. That said, how we raise money for the budget is, of course, a really important tool for changing the macroeconomy. So thinking about how can we encourage certain behaviours that align with a wellbeing economy, whether that's maybe reducing taxes on worker cooperatives or reducing taxes on earned income and increasing those on wealth. And we're starting to see those debates really come into the mainstream in the last year or so. But also the budget can't do it all. The OECD warned that the budget process alone cannot and should not assume onto itself the responsibilities for solving all the problems of society. So in other words, we need to look at systems change governing, not just wellbeing budgeting. And here I want to speak about the wellbeing economy government story. In 2017, after about 18 months of many, many conversations and advocacy and a little bit of hustling, in the margins of a major international conference in a really, really cramped room in the University of Glasgow, just a couple of metres from their statue of Adam Smith, the first meeting of what became the Wellbeing Economy Government's Partnership was held. We had Nicola Sturgeon there and representatives from various other governments. It was launched formally a year later at the OECD's Wellbeing Forum in South Korea, with New Zealand, Iceland and Scotland saying that they wanted to partner together to collaborate on this mission of putting collective wellbeing at the heart of economic policy making. In the last year, they've been joined by Wales and Finland. Canada are also a regular participant in those conversations, and a few other governments are sidling up and wanting to be part of this. They work via policy labs, which are essentially a safe space for civil servants to share their challenges and share what they're up to and learn from each other. And how I describe them best is from a quote from the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, who says, "A good society is one that knows it's not yet good enough." All these governments are united by their humility that they've got a long way to go in putting wellbeing into policy making, let alone creating wellbeing economies. And so finally, I want to share with you, because Peter and Lynn asked me for a few policy solutions, and I'm afraid they're not quite solutions, they're more approaches, because I think the important aspect of this agenda is to have different conversations about the economy, looking upstream, talking about pre-distribution rather than just redistribution, talking about flourishing rather than just being content to treat and patch and repair, talk about preservation in the first place rather than patching up losses. And stop, this is the second one, stop muddling up means and ends. Embrace the role of the economy as in service of well-being goals, not an objective in its own right. And when it comes to growth and economic growth and GDP, this means we should be fair weather friends of growth rather than its ever faithful followers. That means thinking about the direction and the composition of growth rather than just its rate every quarter of the economy. And finally, I want to put in a plug for long-term budgeting. And we do this with physical infrastructure via capital budgets. Let's do it in terms of social and societal impact. This will help us look upstream and across the system. And it's in those terrains where we see the suite of root causes, not just the downstream symptoms. I want to just finish by saying I'm really excited to say that there's a Wellbeing Economy Alliance hub starting in Australia, WEAll Oz, and you're all really welcome to be part of that and join that if you want to support this agenda of creating an economy that works for people and planet. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you, Katherine. That was wonderful. It's such a stimulating and thought-provoking and important contribution to the thinking taking place across the world on wellbeing budgets and how important are they in this day and age. I want to go straight to questions and then I'll come back and do a more complete vote of thanks. But I wondered if there was anyone in the room, and we'll have a look and see who's online as well for those questions. Any questions for Katherine? Yes. Okay.
Hi, Katherine. Jonathan Miller from Steady State ACT. Look, a couple of questions if I could. The first one is, in a town like Canberra, or really in terms of the whole political discourse, neoclassical economics is very much the frame, and other disciplines are rather suppressed in their voice in public policy. Do you find that taking a wellbeing economy approach privileges some of those other disciplinary approaches relatively? And I guess my other question is the extent to which degrowth voices, particularly in Europe, are also informing the wellbeing economy or WEAll approach. Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yes, explicitly, the wellbeing economy approach is about a pluralism of approaches to the economy, bringing into the fore feminist thinking, ecological thinking, behavioural economics, and so on, and really understanding that there is a suite of ways that we should be understanding and analysing the economy, and then thinking about prescriptions for policymakers. And you're right. There has been a real disproportionate attention to a fairly narrow sort of economic analysis that has then informed policy making for too many decades. And yet we've had scholars in economics departments, in business departments, in various quarters of the academy asking different questions, taking different approaches. And in recent years, what's really beautiful is you've had economics students themselves coming out of their classrooms and saying to their lecturers, stop teaching us this curricula that doesn't bear any resemblance to the world that we see, that dismisses environmental impact as an externality that we can just fix later and ignore it, that says we need to bring in questions around the care economy and all that work of social reproduction, so often done by women, that happens outside the formal market economy. So yeah, very much the wellbeing economy approach is about embracing that pluralism of perspectives. And the question around degrowth, yes, I mean, you'll probably be aware it's really gaining a lot of traction, particularly in Europe, particularly amongst a community of scholars and also a community of activists. This is analysis saying that if you look at the science around planetary boundaries, countries in the rich industrialized world cannot keep growing in the material sense that they have over the last few decades, because that's putting too much pressure on the planet and it's taking more than our fair share of ecological room. And so what they're calling for is degrowth, which means not necessarily our move to recession, but it means planned change in the material throughput of an economy. And so very much that analysis informs the thinking around the wellbeing economy agenda. I'll be really honest with you, though, Jonathan, I find the term degrowth not particularly useful in policy conversations. I like to talk about an economy that's better than growth, or as I said earlier, being fair weather friends of growth, because there's plenty that we need more of. As degrowth scholars would say, we need to nurture and cultivate those aspects of life that are really important and aligned with our collective well-being. We need more worker cooperatives. We need more community renewable energy. We need more community gardens. There's so much of what we need more of. So it's about taking a qualitative look at what we need to grow and what we need to power down, and how do we help transition those communities and workers whose livelihoods depend on those particular sectors that we cannot sustain if we're taking the science around the environmental crisis seriously.
there another question? Yes, here.
Greg Wood, Katherine, and thank you for a very stimulating talk. One of the sort of puzzles I'm trying to begin to get a glimpse of is how do these concepts and systems you're working with weigh up and trade off the well-being of those here and now with the well-being of a future generation? What is the way you judge one against the other?
Thanks, David. I can see the back of your head, I think. It's so lovely to see you again. Really, really good question. And I think one of the important aspects of this conversation is public deliberation. I've just been involved in the Scotland Climate Assembly that had 100 people that were almost a microcosm of Scotland. They represented Scotland in terms of age, education, attitudes to climate change. And through a series of deliberations where you had experts on tap rather than on top, they worked through these various questions around how Scotland needed to change its economy, its infrastructure, its design of cities in order to have a just transition towards an economy that's not putting undue pressure on the planet, that's supporting people in the here and now, and that's also paying attention to future stocks of environmental capital and natural capital. And so I think deliberation has to be at the forefront of it. That would be my one key answer to that question, is bring people into that conversation. And you see so many beautiful examples where people are given the information and have time to reflect and debate and discuss with each other. They come to incredible prescriptions. There's also the UK Climate Assembly too. It's worth looking at some of the suggestions from that, because what these assemblies do is they really prove that public reticence is not an excuse, because actually members of the public, when they deliberate on these discussions, are ready to go further than politicians probably give them credit for. But it's really heartening to have a look at the outcomes. The Scottish one, it's published today, actually. I just got a note in my inbox this morning, so it's worth looking at both the UK and the Scottish Climate Assembly.
Thanks, Katherine. David Morovitz. Just a quick reaction to Greg's question and then another question. In economics in general, when you're comparing benefits today and benefits in 50 years' time, the way they traditionally have done it is by using discount rates. So if you want to give more emphasis on benefits 50 years from now than you normally would, then you use a very low discount rate. If you want to talk about only the next couple of years, you use a very high discount rate. Don't know if that's what's on the menu there. And my other question is, you were saying that in Australia there's going to be a group now working. Can you say a bit more about what sort of people they're looking for? And maybe you could send an email to Lynn and she can distribute it to all the people, just giving contact details and so on.
That'd be fantastic, David. Thank you. So the way the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, the group that I was one of the co-founders of, the way we work is as a global team. And then what's been really beautiful over the last few years is that we've seen a bubbling up of local hubs. So the Scottish hub is one at the forefront, but there's also just this week, Ireland had its first hub launch. There's one in the Netherlands, in Canada, in California, in New Zealand. And then some of our partners in Australia are wanting to come together to think about how can we have a Wellbeing Economy Alliance hub in Australia. The key question is, how can it add value to what's already happening? How can it help connect folks who are wanting to work together on economic system change? So it's housed by NENA, which is the New Economy Network of Australia. And they wanted me to flag it today. They're very, very new. They've just got, I think, one page on the NENA website, but they'd be really keen to hear from all sorts of folks, whether you're scholars or in business or in policy making or in community work. But if you share that idea of an economy working for people and planet, and you want to work with others to bring that about, that's essentially how I describe what a WEAll hub is about. So I'll certainly share the contact details with Lynn. Thank you.
Thanks, Katherine. We have a question online from Steve Cork. What do you feel are the main reasons that governments give for not adopting wellbeing approaches to budgets?
Good question. I think it's really fascinating. I think the conversation within governments has really, really moved on. I've been working on this work around beyond GDP, particularly for over a decade. And when I first started doing that, I'd have to spend most of my meeting with a civil servant, a public servant, going through some of the flaws of GDP. I don't need to do that anymore. And by no means that's because of me. That's because that understanding and the evidence base and the critique has just really been shared so extensively now. The question now is, well, GDP is still quite sticky, not least in the way the media uses it. And I often think until, say, the UK Chancellor Rishi Sunak, the day after his budget, he goes into a media studio, Channel 4 on the BBC, for example, and the first question is, Rishi, what's this going to do for the well-being of future generations? What's this going to do for levels of homelessness in the UK? What's this going to do for the rising numbers of people who are lonely or people who feel that they don't have enough money to take care of their family? But what happens is he will get asked, what's this going to do for the UK growth? The Scottish equivalent question will be, what's this going to do for Scotland's GDP compared to the UK, which is just going around in those circles. So I think how we start to hold politicians accountable for these other measures is really key. As I said, I think our colleagues in statistics offices, to a great extent, have done their job. They count so much of this, and the baton in a way needs to be passed to policy entrepreneurs to move mechanisms of accountability and to draw those lines of those measures of well-being and government priorities, because at the moment so often GDP tends to trump all other decision making when it comes to the crunch. The other challenge is that people assume that GDP will lead to those good lives. So the way we talk about here in the UK, economic recovery after COVID, people just think about it as faster GDP growth, when we know that previous GDP growth prior to COVID was happening alongside rising levels of insecure work and contingent work, rising levels of people turning up at food banks because they weren't earning enough to put food on the table, rising levels of loneliness and antidepressant use. All of that was happening concurrently to rising GDP. And so it isn't the automatic read across that maybe in the past we could have assumed it was. And so I think there is something about opening up those conversations around what is it we really need to prioritise. And Steve, there is something about the simplicity of GDP in terms of that one number. There are big debates, as you'll probably be aware, in the Beyond GDP movement about one number and dashboards, given that dashboards can better take account of the complexity of quality of life questions. I think we need both. I think we need something simple that we can track over time. I'd much prefer it was something like the number of girls who ride their bikes to school, rather than something technical like Gini coefficients or something. I think it needs to be something that makes intuitive sense and resonates with everyday audiences and the general public if we're going to start to move beyond GDP.
Is there another question? I've got another one. Yes. Take one here and then there's another one online.
David Ween, thank you very much, Katherine. That's been a very helpful talk. I am interested in what you've said about the initiatives by governments in Wales, Scotland and New Zealand for the introduction of wellness budgets and wellness policies. New Zealand, for example, you identified five priority areas that they had outlined. Can you give me some examples of the practical implementation of some of these policies? For example, can you give me some examples where governments have dedicated real money to some of these initiatives, and then where did they take the money from to invest in these new areas of activity?
Thanks, David. One of the things I think is really exciting in Scotland, and as I said, often some of the best policies won't have the word well-being in the title, so you have to look for sort of policies that are about reshaping the nature of the economic system. And I'd also, and this is a challenge to a lot of colleagues in the wellbeing movement and also social justice colleagues, that it's not necessarily about spending, because so often some of that spending is driven by in response to harm that has already been created. So whether it's, I'll give you an example. In Scotland, at the moment, the social justice sector is very excited because they've convinced the Scottish government to increase child poverty payments of about £10 a week for low-income households. And they see that as a great win. I think actually it's a dire indictment that government is having to step in and pay £10 a week because families are not able to earn enough to keep their kids and their families above the breadline. I think it's a complete sign of the failure of the economy to do enough of the heavy lifting. And so an example of a sort of antidote to that is the support that the Scottish government gives to what I describe as pro-social business models. They're really putting their shoulder into information provision, education, advice, and also just really promoting the idea of different business models that are commercially viable, but doing so in order to promote social and environmental objectives. So they're making profit, but doing so for a reason. And so worker cooperatives are a great example of that. Social enterprises, community interest companies, and so on. B Corps are a big flourishing example. There's a whole plethora of business models out there that are about designing businesses. So it's in their DNA to focus on some of these goals as well, but being commercially viable as they do so. And that's the sort of policy making that I think we would need to see more of when governments are serious about creating wellbeing economies, rather than just topping up and healing the damage that an economy that's not delivering that has created. So it's not just in a way about social spending, it's about restructuring of the economy.
And a question from Karen von Struck online. Do you think that the Australian coalition government's resistance to taxing mining companies and investing the proceeds for future generations, as Norway has done so successfully, is evidence of a very short-term attitude to economics? I think that's a Dorothy Dixer.
So I've been out of Australia for 15 years, so I feel a little bit fraudulent commenting too much on Australian politics. But what I can tell you is that here in the UK, there's work on a Just Transition Commission to really help transition communities away from dependency on particularly oil extraction in the North Sea, working with communities so that they can really feel that their livelihoods won't be wobbly as that transition takes place, helping them train and move into alternative sources of income and earning, help the towns around them adjust as well. And crucially, that's done in consultation with those communities. I think one of the risks, and there's been research done with coal mining communities in Queensland that I've read, where they feel these changes are imposed upon them, they'll quite naturally hold on for dear life, for the security that they know. But the idea of governments continuing to subsidise, whether that is through tax breaks or whether that's through infrastructure provision or other forms of subsidy, fossil fuel industries, is just so misaligned with that embracing that transition. We're starting to see governments around the world make very bold pledges around net zero. My understanding is that Australia hasn't yet made its net zero pledge, but you've got the UK pledging to be net zero by 2050, even China pledging to be net zero by 2060. Scotland inevitably has tried to better the UK by saying they will be net zero by 2045. And so you see governments starting to come out. The key thing now is, and this speaks to David's previous question, around how do you go from those nice pledges and those ambitious targets to putting the plans in place. And that's a much trickier question because it involves powering down certain industries. Karen, that's a long answer, but I think you can probably tell I'm very much in sympathy with the guts of your question.
Yeah, great. Is there Bob? And then we might just take one more. So if we go Bob first. Oh. Did you have one, Emma? No, that's okay.
Thank you very much. This has been an excellent presentation. You've singled out the evidence that the ACT in Australia is beginning to move in this direction, and I would like to invite you to comment on how we as ACT citizens, those of us who are ACT citizens, can most effectively assist the government to take this challenge on?
That's a great question, Bob. Do you know, I think it's celebrating when good policies happen. It's hard work being a politician. I mean, I work with some incredible politicians who work their socks off trying to grapple with this, not least having, gone through a pandemic and all those impossible decisions that governments around the world have had to take in the last 18 months or so, but even prior to that. And I think really noticing when useful policies are put in place, celebrating that, so they counter perhaps some of the flack that they'll hear, and really, from perhaps vested interests, because some of these policies do need to challenge vested interests and people who derive power from the current state of affairs. And so I think really just supporting governments of whatever colour, and engaging with them, being present in the community consultations that they've been doing, and encouraging, I think, is really important. But also, having said that, call them out when they don't go far enough. Call them out when they muddle up means and ends. Call them out when they don't look upstream enough and they just are focused on tinkering around the edges and patching and healing and repairing the damage that's done, and they're celebrating that as a win. Recognise that that's essentially a humanitarian response, but we need to do better and raise our gaze to the root causes. So, yeah, keep them accountable. But also, I'd say, just as a citizen, it's about your own choices. And I don't think this is all about individual lifestyle change by any means, but I do think if you're able to make choices around your spending, which businesses you support, investments, transport options, those sorts of things, that also matters, not least in the impact it has. But what it does is if more and more people adopt those behaviours that are aligned with these sorts of outcomes, what it does is it starts to build a momentum that will then help politicians see that this is what people want, and then hopefully they'll then get on the right side and create policies and the regime and the infrastructure that's more supportive of those sort of activities as well. So you're also demonstrating your enthusiasm for this sort of work.
And just our final question.
Robert Cussell, thank you for a brilliant talk. I'm just contemplating how difficult it must be to measure the outcomes from this approach. I just wonder, you've said a little bit about it, but can you expand on that? It must be quite a challenge.
Outcomes in terms of system change, yes, but in terms of well-being outcomes, I think there's a measurement community has actually really done a pretty cracking job over the last few decades, but particularly in OECD countries where they've got fairly well-resourced statistics offices. I mean, government statistics agencies do count. Yes, we could always have more timely data. We could always have better quality data, perhaps larger sample sizes. But I don't think anymore it's lack of statistics or lack of good data that's the reason that we're not moving in this direction. As I said, I think the baton is being passed to policy entrepreneurs to do something with these measures and put the changes in the policy regime that are so necessary. Some of these questions are subjective and qualitative, things like trust or how anxious do you feel or sense of purpose or perhaps dignity at work. But there's quite rigorous work around capturing that as well. People who are much smarter and more qualified than I am are really working on building the evidence base around that, debating the technicalities of that data capture, questioning around, is there a cultural bias? Does it matter how the question's framed? The limits of having a 1 to 10 scale, etc. But there really is a lot of science around data. So I feel confident actually that it's not the lack of data that's holding us back. I think you're ready to springboard into the next era of this agenda.
Great. Thank you so much, Katherine. And it's just amazing work that you're doing and such important work. And I wanted to say that in your book, The Economics of Arrival, that David had earlier, I particularly like the rationale you offered for the why of wellbeing budgets, which you outlined as the importance of societies deeply thinking about how best to nurture the art of life itself. which is a beautiful quote, I thought. And you'll be aware that these questions are being taken on by other groups such as the World Economic Forum, who recently launched the Great Reset, emphasising the importance of global cooperation and saying that in part this will require a review of how the prevailing stakeholders can ensure that the struggles and challenges of the most vulnerable groups are represented and supported. And you certainly went through that this evening. And as you outlined, this shift will require that the conventional economic model, with its emphasis on individuals, competition and self-interest, see that the true economic and indeed political success, as we've been speaking about today, requires people to cooperate if we are to achieve benefits for the whole community. And I also liked that you drew our attention to the language of wellbeing budgets, including the work of Jacinda Ardern, and you didn't specifically mention, but I like the work of Ursula von der Leyen in the EU as well, and their language on thriving and long-term economic cycles, empathy and psychological safety. And I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if robo-debt could never happen again because politicians embedded the principle of psychological safety into wellbeing and welfare policy. So wellbeing budgets challenge governments wanting to reimagine how economic progress can sit alongside environmental, social and community progress. And in your talk tonight, you've really outlined that and given us a lot of work to do. So certainly we will be working here at Australia 21 alongside your work, Katherine, and we very much look forward to that. Thank you so much again, and please everyone, thank Katherine. Thanks, Katherine. Thank you. And we'll have, do I have dessert now? And then everyone look forward to seeing you in the morning for what will be a wonderful session tomorrow morning as well. Thank you. Yeah.